Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, OSEP questions and answers on serving children with disabilities placed by their parents in private schools, presented by Dan Shearer and Lisa Pagano. Okay. My name is Miriam Aliso from CIPR, the Center for Parent Information and Resources, and I'm going to walk you on how to interact with some of these Zoom features. So please use the Q&A to ask questions to the presenters and use the chat if you need to communicate with us regarding any technical issue. And we have a feature called closed caption that is provided by Zoom. If you would like to use it, please click on CC and you will, the closed caption will be displayed on your screen. Para acceder al canal en español, van a ver en la banda negra un globo que indica interpretación, interpretation. Haga clic allí. Luego seleccionan español y oprimen donde dice mute original audio. Esto último filtra completamente el sonido en inglés para que puedan escuchar con claridad a nuestra intérprete Raquel. And Carmen Sanchez is going to explain the objectives of this presentation.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Carmen Sanchez. I'm the program lead for the parent programs that consist of the Parent Training Information Centers and the Community Parent Resource Centers. Thank you for coming to this webinar to look at the guidance that's just been put out around privately placed students. And we think this will have really useful information that you will find you can use when you're talking to your families and providing them support. So my colleagues in the Office of Special Education Programs, Dan Shire and Lisa Pagano, will be doing the actual webinar. Please, as Miriam already said, put in your questions in the questions and answer, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. And be able to answer your questions. And then again, if you have any other issues, you can also use the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Shire. Thanks again.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's good to participate in a webinar with everyone again since last saw you guys in October. So I'm glad to be here. First, I also wanted to give a shout out to a couple of audience members. I know we have Pamela Allen and Melissa Schrader from our Office of Non-Public Education at the U.S. Department of Education. I know they're in today's webinar. The office, if you don't know, the Office of Non-Public Education provides a lot of great resource and supports to parents and families who reach out to them on not just special education, but all sorts of equitable service requirements for all the title programs that the department administers. They also work with private schools. So they're great partners and great collaborators, and it's been great to get this guidance out. So thanks to Pamela and Melissa for their support and collaboration. So just briefly, so I know we've got a lot of good slides to get through, do want to sort of lay out how this presentation is structured, talk about our basic requirements on parentally placed private school children with disabilities, and you're going to see the PPPSCWD acronym. That's parentally placed private school children with disabilities. Because it's a mouthful, we decided to create a new acronym for this. Explain how the dispute resolution processes work for when disputes arise over these requirements. And also provide opportunities for any questions that we get through the chats or I guess over the webinar. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so if you haven't had a chance to take a look, if you have the old 2011 guidance compared to the 2022, you're going to see a lot of questions that do repeat. So there are, we are based on our regulations and the statute, so those haven't changed in these areas, but we do have updates. The updates are included based on policy letters that we wanted to incorporate in this, other questions and answers that we've had, interactions with states based on sort of the way they're implementing these requirements, and also we've had a government accountability audit that government accountability office audit that we needed to resolve, and this guidance is going to go a long way into addressing their concerns. So we do have two areas that are brand new that were not in the previous 2011 guidance, and so we'll go over those briefly as well. And go to the next slide. All right, so this is sort of our regulations in for permanently placed private school children with disabilities. They are not necessarily easy to understand, and they're complex. So it's definitely worth taking a reread of our regs, and also understand that there's a big distinction for PPPS CWD, right? There is, while they may receive special education if they're designated to receive services on an equitable through equitable services, there is not an entitlement to FAPE for those children who are permanently placed and served in a private school. And that's really what this slide distinguishes and points out. So there might be a wide range of services that are offered through an equitable services plan, but that entitlement to FAPE does not exist for PPPS CWD. So that's what we wanted to make clear about in this slide. And that's what this guidance really does focus on, are those kids who are in private schools. And that's why we say FAPE is not an issue, because we know that in some cases children go to private schools because they need FAPE and they need to go to a private school to receive FAPE. And that's when the LEA is providing that and paying for those services. But this is not what this guidance addresses. All right, then go to the next slide. All right, so just briefly as a recap and a reminder about overall our requirements for equitable services. So like all children, and similar to the presentation we gave to you in October, right, there's an expectation that throughout the state and in every LEA and every jurisdiction, that every child who has suspected disability is identified, located, and evaluated, right? And that's true for children who attend private schools, right? So the expectation is that occurs. And I know Pamela did give a presentation to the parent centers previously, so on the child find requirements. So we don't want to go into that in great details, but we do within the guidance explain the child find obligations. So I want to make sure that if you haven't had a chance to review that, there are those requirements, and the LEAs where the private school is located have that obligation. So once, and this has been very clear from IDA in 2004, that there is a mechanism. So when you figure out, when the LEA gets its LEA subgrant for both 611, the 3 through 21, and the 619, the 3 through 5 subgrants, they have to reserve a portion of their IDA funds for those children who are PPPS CWD. And it has to, and essentially it's called proportionate share because it's a proportion. So if 10% of the children, of the total number of children within LEA's jurisdiction go to private schools, you have to reserve 10% of your IDA funds for equitable services. And in some states, and this varies as state specific, if a state defines an elementary or secondary school as including homeschool children, then they have to be included in the count as well. So it's really important, and we expect states to do this to ensure that LEAs have that ability to identify and count all these children, because that's how you're going to make the correct proportionate share calculations. And we go to the next slide. So unlike for children who are receiving FAPE through an IEP, that's typically based on where the child lives. That's typically the LEA or district where the IEP is implemented. For our proportionate share requirements, it's where the private school is located. They're responsible for conducting the activities and potentially, in developing the equitable services and going through the process of arranging for those to occur. It's not where the child lives. And we've issued, and we mentioned this in the guidance, that this could even be, even if the child lives in a different state. So I used to live in Massachusetts, and it was not unheard of that kids from New Hampshire would go to private schools in Massachusetts because there were more there, that they would be, that school where in Massachusetts, where the private school is located, is responsible for ensuring the child find and doing the calculations of proportion and determining the number of children. It could also apply internationally, we've said. So, for example, if you live in Michigan, it's pretty easy to get from Ontario to Michigan. And so there might be families who, bring their child to a private school in Michigan while they work in Detroit. And in that case, those kids would be included as well in proportionate share calculations. So the difference, though, is that if through the evaluation process, where once again, it's where the school is located, they would do the evaluation to determine eligibility for potential equitable services. If the parent indicates that they would prefer to receive special education through an IEP and receive FAPE, then it goes back to the child's district of residence. And so one of the things we do want to discourage is that parents shouldn't be, shopping for evaluations. They should really be clear about how they want services potentially to be provided and work with the appropriate district, and whether it's for an IEP or potentially for equitable services. And you can see in our slides, we referenced the questions and answers where we address each of these topics. All right, next slide. All right, so we do, if you haven't looked at our regulations in a while, we do have some appendices in the back. One of them talks about proportionate share calculations. This is one of our easier mathematical challenges that we have in IDA, but it's also in regulation in 300-133. So it has to be that total amount. You can't, so for example, some LEAs might reserve funds for coordinated early intervention services, which are called CEIS. But you have to make the calculation, the reservation off the entire amount before you take any reservations, whether it's for voluntary CEIS, for significant disproportionality, whether you give money to, whether you blend funds through a school-wide program, it always is off the total amount for the reservation. And we would expect that the LEAs, should have that information available, should be not only sharing it with the private schools, but also making it forward with the state so they can make sure the state is correct. In some states, the states will make the calculation for all the LEAs because they'll gather all the data on all the private schools. But it is the total amounts. That's the big takeaway when you make the reservation calculations for proportionate share. All right, go to the next slide. So one of the things, and this is when we get to the real important parts of determining how these funds are going to be used for PPPS CWD, that's something through the process called meaningful consultation. It's really important. It's the process in which the LEA officials meet with representatives from private schools, parent groups, and they essentially talk it out. And it should be a discussion that's ongoing throughout the school year, and really getting and soliciting input and making sure that the needs of children where they're receiving service in the private school, that there's a good, robust dialogue and good opportunity to decide how those funds are best going to be used to support those kiddos. Now, ultimately, it is an LEA decision, but once again, if they do it without having that consultation and without getting the input, it's problematic, and in fact, it'd be inconsistent with IDA. So ultimately, one of the challenges with this is that in many districts, there's probably not enough funds to support all the needs of all the permanently placed private school children, because it's a percentage. Typically, it's a relatively small percentage. So there's not enough funds to go around to provide services to all the kids. So that's why it's really important to have these consultations and the discussions. Then ultimately, if one private school was suggesting we want speech therapy for all our children, and another private school says physical therapy, and the district says, well, based on sort of all the input, we're going to decide on providing speech therapy for these schools, they need to make those determinations and let everyone know that this is how the rationale behind the decisions. so that the private schools and the parent representative groups can understand that. We can go to the next slide. So here's some of the topics that should be occurring throughout the school year and throughout potentially the whole calendar year. Is being discussed during those meaningful consultations is how child find is being conducted, ensuring that it's a robust system that's consistent with IDEA, sharing how the LEA made the determination based on sort of the child count data and the data of the children enrolled in private schools, how they've made that calculation, including sort of the who, what, when, where, why, and how with regards to the provision of equitable services, and the process of how to continue to provide consultation throughout the school year and calendar year as well. So this should not just be a one-time deal, but once again, it should be ongoing. So for example, if there's additional stimulus funds that came through, like it did last year with the ARP Act, be a very important reason to have additional consultation with LEAs and representatives of parents. I believe it might just about done with slides. It might be time for Lisa. I might have one more. Let's see. Or am I?
I think you're done for
I
now.
think I'm done for now.
You are done for now, but don't go far away because I'm sure our audience has lots of good questions for you as we get wrapped up. But first, before I get into the substance of my presentation, I want to acknowledge we are being joined today by our OSEP director, Valerie Williams. Thanks for joining us, Valerie. And also David Cantrell, who is our deputy OSEP director, and he did a nice long stint as an acting OSEP director. We're so pleased to have both of them with us today. I will tell you right up front, I cannot do that acronym that Dan rolls off the tongue. So you're going to have to hear me say a few extra syllables, so bear with me on that. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is really required of LEAs in providing equitable services, and that's the term that you need to get comfortable with. That's the name of the services. That's the term we use for the services that are provided to parentally placed private school children with disabilities who are designated to receive those services. You'll recall Dan talked about through the consultation process, which really is the centerpiece, I would say, of all of these requirements. It's where it all starts. We have the consultation with really key folks who can help inform the LEA about what are the service needs of parentally placed private school children in the jurisdiction of the LEA. You know, how best can these funds be used to the benefit of those children, and how the group, this consultation group, is going to operate throughout the year. So as if there are changes or adjustments that need to be made, that they can come together and have the kind of discussions that are so important to inform good, solid decisions about how best to use this proportionate share of the IDEA funds. I will tell you that, as Dan said, that parents of children who are placed by their parents in private schools, and again, these are not parents who are looking for the LEA to pay for the placement. These are not kids for whom the LEA has said, we can't meet their needs, we're going to place them in a private school and we're going to pay for it. These are parents who have said, I'm choosing a private school education for my child, and I know that my child is not going to receive FAPE. I will tell you, in my time in working with the state of Maryland, I oversaw the complaint resolution process there before joining OSEP. And in my role in supporting our customer services specialists at OSEP, there is a lot of confusion with some parents who don't understand. I pay taxes like everybody else. Why can't my child get FAPE if I choose to put them in a private school? And some of those conversations can be a little bit uncomfortable. So if you've never had one of those conversations before, whether you would want to role play or practice how you would explain what IDEA requirements are related to this group of children whose parents have chosen private school for them, and are not expecting the LEA to pay for that private school, it might be a helpful experience. So again, that it's something that might not always seem to make sense when you're talking to a parent, but it's important to recognize what IDEA requires. And what IDEA does require is the expenditure of a proportionate share of those public funds for the benefit of this population of students. So as you'll see in this slide, we talk about equitable services. It is not FAPE, but I do want to point out there are some states under their state laws have decided to expand and require more services for children who are placed in private schools by their parents. So although IDEA doesn't require it, under state law, they may require additional state funds be spent, local funds, to perhaps as much as provide, an IEP to provide FAPE, but that's under state law. Today, we're talking about what's required under IDEA. So it's important, or I would think it's important for you guys in your roles to be able to explain to parents, if you're in one of those states like Massachusetts or Rhode Island, I think there might be 9 or 10, I don't know the exact count, but that do provide for something beyond what IDEA requires, that you're familiar with that so that you can make sure you're providing accurate information to the parents that you're supporting. So the other thing I wanted to mention is under state law, looking for a Kleenex, I'm sorry. This all goes right on the recording too, doesn't it? Under state law, states can choose to have homeschool children be considered parentally placed private school children. Not every state does that. In some states, they do say, okay, we're going to consider the population of children who are being homeschooled as parentally placed private school children. In that case, they need to be counted. Dan talked about having an accurate count of children. They need to be part of the consultation process. They need to be considered in that consultation process as the group is looking at what services should be provided using the proportionate share of funds. So again, a state-specific thing that you as folks across the country will want to find out, does my state consider homeschooled children to be parentally placed private school children that would be covered under the equitable services requirements? So if a child is designated to receive equitable services, as Dan pointed out, maybe not every child's going to get something, but if a child is designated to be one of the children who is to receive services, equitable services, they are going to have a services plan developed and implemented for them by the LEA where the private school is located. That services plan can include special education and related services. You're probably very familiar with the content requirements for IEPs, right? We have a nice long list of what has to be in an IEP in order for it to be compliant with IDEA requirements. For a services plan, the content may be similar, but because these children are not entitled to FAPE and are not going to have all of the services necessary to meet all of the needs related to their disability, their services plan is going to include only the services that the LEA is going to provide. Dan gave an example of an LEA that decides it's going to do speech therapy services, right? Or if they decided they were going to do speech therapy and physical therapy services, but they're not going to do physical therapy services. If a child needed physical therapy, it's not on the list of what the LEA is providing through equitable services. So that would not be on the child services plan. The service plan just details clearly so everybody knows what they can expect the LEA to provide to that parentally placed private school child. Another example I wanted to share is services can be special ed and related services directly provided to a child with a disability, but it can also be using those proportionate share of funds for things that may be more indirect, professional development, training, consulting with the teachers of the private school so they are better able to properly support and educate a child with a disability. It could be purchasing materials, but again, there are some very specific requirements about how those materials, what those materials may be, because oftentimes we're talking about children attending religious schools. And of course, the public school is not going to purchase religiously affiliated materials. So you can take a look at the questions noted here on the slide for that. I did want to point out that there's this thing that we call incidental benefit in IDEA, and it's basically a concept that allows children other than the specific child with a disability to receive some type of incidental benefit. They're not the focus of the service or the focus of the support, but they may receive some incidental benefit from the service that's being provided to the child with a disability. So just like public school children who can receive an incidental benefit from the special ed services that are provided to a child in a classroom, so may private school children also receive an incidental benefit. Dan talked about the calculation for the proportionate share, and the amount of that money should be transparent. You know, the public should be able to find out how much did the LEA need to spend on its population of parentally placed private school children. Sometimes it's this much, sometimes it could be quite a lot. But once, whatever that amount is, once they have exhausted those funds, they have spent those funds for allowable purposes, then they have met the proportionate share requirements. So a state or an LEA could not require them to spend more than that amount of the proportionate share. So let's go on to the next slide. I know I talked a lot about that one. Let's move on to talk a little bit about where are services provided and who actually provides these services to parentally placed private school children with disabilities. The department has emphasized in the newly released guidance, as well as in the 2011 Q&A, that services really should be provided on site at the child's private school. And we think that's important so as to not disrupt the child's educational program and their educational experience, having to be transported back and forth to another site to receive their equitable services. The guidance states and says this in a couple of places, I think, that unless there's a compelling reason or compelling rationale for those services to be provided away from the private school site, that they really should be provided at the child's private school. If it is necessary to provide the services at a different location, then the LEA needs to look at whether transportation is needed in order for that child to access the service. And we're giving you just an example here. There may be a child with physical therapy needs who requires specialized equipment that really is not able to be transported from the public agencies, from the LEA school. And so they need to bring the parentally placed private school child over to the public school where the equipment is so that the child can receive the therapy they need to address their gross motor skill needs. So that might be an example. If that's the case, then they need to make sure that if transportation is needed for that child to access those services, that it's provided. I'll say here, but I think it might be on a slide somewhere else. Those transportation costs, those can all be part of the proportionate share. And so one of the reasons it's so important to try to provide services on site at the child's private school is to minimize, if you will, the amount of money that has to be spent on transportation, because that all can be deducted from the proportionate share. If the goal is to provide as many appropriate quality services to meet a child's needs as possible, we would hope that a lot of that money wouldn't have to be taken away to use for transportation for the child. So we've talked about where should the services be provided. If services, transportation is required. And I'm going to read my notes because this is a little bit hard for me to make sure I get clear. So, and you'll see in the Q&A, transportation from the child's school or the child's home to a site other than the private school, and from the service site to the private school or to the child's home, depending on the timing of the services. Those are circumstances when the LEA would need to provide transportation if necessary for the child to access the service. But there's no requirement to transport the child from their home to their private school if the only reason the transportation is being provided is just to get the child to the private school. So pay attention to those requirements. You can maybe understand why I wanted to read that, because I wanted to make sure I got the words exactly right. Who provides services? And there's some flexibility in this. LEAs can provide services to children at their private school themselves, or some LEAs choose to contract. They have a third-party provider that they pay to go in and provide the services to parentally placed private school children at their private schools. It really is the LEA's decision. But again, part of this, what did I say is the central piece? These decisions are all based on, let's talk about it. What makes sense? What's going to work for our population of parentally placed private school children with disabilities? So after the LEA consults, takes in all that information, they make the ultimate decision whether they're going to use their own personnel to provide the services, or if they're going to perhaps pay a private school staff member to provide the services outside of their usual private school duties, or contract perhaps with a third party. And we have a whole series of questions about who can provide these services. The personnel qualifications do vary depending on who provides the services. If it's an LEA employee, then they need to meet the IDEA requirements. And those are spelled out very clearly in the Q&A in section G. You're probably going to want to take a look at that in case questions come about from parents. So who actually gives these services to my child? If a private school employee provides the service, then they do not have to meet IDEA's personnel qualifications. I believe we do have a question that indicates a state could choose to go beyond IDEA and have more rigorous qualification requirements, but IDEA itself does not impose those qualifications on private school personnel who provide equitable services. Let's move on to the next slide, please. I'm going to take a little sip. So we've received a number of questions over the years about what about preschool children? Are preschool children with disabilities included in the population of children who may be eligible for equitable services? And one of the threshold questions is, does the private preschool where the child is attending, does it meet the state's definition of elementary school? Because there are some private preschools that will not meet that definition. And if that's the case, then we would not consider that child to be a parentally placed, private school child that would be in the mix for equitable services. We've received questions about, states. Typically, their Section 619 grants are nowhere as near as large as their Section 611, the 3 to 21-year-old grant. I'm sorry, the 3 through 21 age children. That's the target population for the 611 grant. Just throw some terminology at you. But states can also get a Section 619 preschool grant to use those funds for children ages 3 through 5. And 5-year-olds may actually be in kindergarten, not in preschool programs. All of these requirements we're talking about, the equitable services requirements, apply to preschool age children, again, who are in preschool, receiving preschool education that meets the state's definition of elementary school. So we have a series of questions in section J that are sort of like, if this happens, what what's the deal? If this is a situation for a child, what's the answer? So you may want to take a look at Section J. There is information that I think gives some really important information about differences from when an LEA may place a preschool age child in a private preschool, maybe because they don't have a really strong full continuum of services for preschoolers with disabilities. So they may end up placing a child in a private preschool for FAPE. Remember, that's not this group. We're not talking about the kids who are placed for FAPE today. So pay attention to Section J so you can become familiarize yourself with when preschool placements may be made for FAPE and when it may be an equitable services situation. Let's move on to the next section. This is a really important new section in the guidance. Dan talked about there had been a GAO, Government Accountability. Oh, I'm failing. I don't remember the O. I know Dan knows it. Study looking at children who are placed in private schools using state voucher and scholarship programs. And, you know, these programs have become increasingly popular in states. And so in this section of the document, we make clear that those children who are attending private schools using state voucher and scholarship programs, if they otherwise meet the definition of a parentally placed private school child with a disability, they must be included in the LEA's count of eligible children. They need to be identified, located, evaluated, reevaluated within that 3-year period, just like public school children, whether children who are placed by their parents in private schools are receiving any equitable services. The LEA still has an obligation to reevaluate those children. And we know the reevaluation requirements in IDEA says at least once every 3 years, unless there's something that happens sooner or the parent and the LEA agree a reevaluation isn't necessary. But just because these children are not receiving any services, the LEA can't forget about them. They've got to make sure they continue to count them when they're reporting their child counts, and they've got to make sure they remember these children and make sure that they have them on their list for reevaluation. We've talked about including them in the child count, having that accurate child count. That's the first step in making sure that the proportionate share calculation is accurate. And again, that they're considered for equitable services the same way as other parentally placed private school children with disabilities. One of the things that we heard through the GAO study is that a concern that was raised is whether these programs can require parents to revoke consent for IDEA services or revoke their child's eligibility for special ed in order to participate in a state voucher or scholarship program. So we'll let you participate, but in order to do this, you've got to say no to everything else under IDEA. And you'll see in Section K, we say that is a problem. That is inconsistent with IDEA. Parents may not be required to revoke their consent for services or revoke their child's eligibility in exchange for participation in a state voucher or scholarship program. Also, these children who participate in a voucher or scholarship program, if they come back to public school and their disability determinations are still current, meaning their evaluation, they haven't been reevaluated, determined they're no longer eligible, they would come back to public school as a child with a disability. So that's why it's so important that states or LEAs not be allowed to require parents to say, no, you don't have to consider my child eligible anymore in exchange for to participate in the scholarship program. So these are important parent rights. I know we're throwing a lot at you today, I'm hoping that you're going to have time to go and kind of dig in, especially on these new sections that were not in the 2011 Q&A. And you can always follow up with us if you have questions. This is not the end of the discussion. Let's move on to the next slide. I'm probably talking too much because I'm taking way too long. Okay, extended public school closures. This is a new section that we added, particularly in light of the challenges associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, along with the unfortunate multiple natural disasters our nation has experienced in so many places, the floods, the fires, tornadoes that have disrupted education to children, including children with disabilities placed by their parents in private schools. So in this section, you'll see that OSEP makes clear that the parentally placed private school children must be provided instruction just as it provides to children enrolled in the LEA during these periods. For example, if they're doing remote and virtual for the general student population, then the LEA would also need to provide its equitable services remotely, virtually, for the children designated in accordance with their services plans. What are we talking about now? Again, back to that critical piece, the consultation process. We shouldn't be surprised by these things anymore. And so through the consultation process, LEAs can talk with the stakeholders in those meetings. So what are we going to do when this happens, or if this happens? How can we make sure we have continuity of services, continuity of communication? So let's move on to the next slide, please. I'm going to take a big sip of water for this one. So if you don't remember anything else that we've talked about today, in your role in answering questions and helping parents to understand IDEA, this is a really critical part of the document and some critical information. It's important that you are aware of the important differences in the dispute resolution options that are available to parents of parentally placed private school children with disabilities. So I know you've probably memorized, and one of the most important things you do is help parents understand their rights and understand the dispute resolution procedures that are available to resolve disagreements. In the case of a parent of a parentally placed private school child, due process complaints and the due process hearings procedures can only be used around issues related to child find. So did the LEA properly identify my child? Was the evaluation appropriate? Did they make the right determination about my child's disability category, for example? You cannot use due process because your child was not designated to receive equitable services, or the parent is dissatisfied with the services plan. Due process can only be used around the child find requirements. There's also no independent right to use mediation. So again, you can't, a parent is not able to say, I want mediation to talk about my services plan. However, a parent can use and mediation must be available to the parent if they file a due process complaint regarding child find, right? That first bullet says you can use due process for child find, and mediation must be available whenever a due process complaint is filed by a parent in this situation. Or a parent could also choose to use the state complaint process regarding anything about equitable services. So back when you used to take tests and it's like C is always a good answer, state complaints are always a good answer in this case, because all of the requirements around equitable services can be the subject of a state complaint. So if you remember nothing else, a state complaint is always available about any concern of an alleged violation of IDEA, including any of the equitable services requirements. There were questions about whether parentally placed private school children with disabilities could be entitled to compensatory services as a remedy. So let's say a parent files a state complaint. My child did not get all the services required by their services plan during the public school closure due to COVID. Can that child be considered for compensatory services? And while the services may be ordered in a state complaint or offered up voluntarily by an LEA, if they've met that required amount of their proportionate share, they can't be required to spend additional federal funds for those compensatory services. The good news is LEAs and states receive a lot of extra funding, associated with trying to remedy lost educational services during the pandemic. So it could be, at least for the time being, there may be funds, even if a state or an LEA had spent their required amount. But the bottom line under IDEA is if they've met that proportionate share, they spent the required amount and they spent it for allowable expenses, then the SEA can't require them to spend anything above that amount. So Section Q is going to be your friend. Section Q goes through all the various dispute resolution options available. So take some time and become familiar with that when you have a minute. And so I'm just going to spend another minute because I know you're tired of hearing me talk, and I'm hoping you've got lots of questions for Dan. Let's go on to the next slide, please. And one of the things that, OSEP has made a point of saying very clearly and as often as we can, our OSEP director, our acting assistant secretary have made very clear in a number of documents that we want to make sure everyone is clear about SEAs being responsible for their general supervisory oversight of LEAs to make sure that LEAs are meeting the requirements of IDEA. And those requirements include those related to parentally placed private school children with disabilities. So here's some examples of what SEAs must do as part of their general supervisory responsibilities to make sure those requirements are implemented appropriately. They need to ensure their LEAs are giving valid and reliable child count data, including the data on parentally placed private school children with disabilities, whether or not those children are actually receiving services. But if they've evaluated a child and determine them eligible under IDEA, they need to make sure that they are keeping accurate records and reporting those data appropriately. They also need to monitor and take whatever actions necessary to ensure LEAs are meeting the requirements for, again, that meaningful consultation process that is so central to meeting the equitable services requirements. Third, they need to make sure LEAs are expending the required proportionate share of their IDEA funds, Part B funds. I didn't say early on, but this is only a Part B requirement. We're not talking about Part C today at all. I'm sorry to bring this in on the last slide, but this is only a Part B requirement. And so lastly, they need to monitor, it's not enough to spend the money, but was the money spent for allowable purposes? And so part of what they would be looking at is the consultation, what was agreed to be provided, and whether or not the funds that were used for those purposes. So with that, I think we are at the end of my portion of the presentation. Our final slide provides you with our contact information. We thank you for taking time to join us this afternoon. I do want to say the Q&A includes much more than what we've talked about today. We tried to highlight the portions that we thought were particularly relevant to you in your roles as folks who are there to support parents, to make sure parents understand their rights. And so we focused on the areas we thought may be most relevant. So we welcome your questions, especially those for Dan. And I'm going to turn it back over to Carmen to maybe be our host or somebody else. It's definitely not me to do that.
We do have
Thank you.
Thank you. We have some questions in the question and answer box. And so the first question we got, and I think you sort of addressed it, but maybe we need additional clarity, is if 619 children that are placed in a for-profit private school by parents because the LEA doesn't provide in-school services, and there aren't openings in traditional daycare centers, are LEAs required to provide services?
I can take that. I think, I mean, I suppose an LEA, Dan, help me, could place a child in a for-profit school, but they would only need to pay for that if they determined it was necessary for FAPE. Is that right?
I think that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, it's,
Yeah. Right. So it would have to be the
yeah.
LEA making the determination that was an appropriate placement for the child, necessary to provide the child with FAPE. That's sort of the bottom line almost with every answer, right? Is it necessary for FAPE?
And just in one thing too, I glossed over really quickly is that IDA does have definitions of elementary school and secondary school within our definitions. And first of all, it's the definition is very clear. It says nonprofit. So, so any child who goes into a for-profit, who's permanently placed in a for-profit school would not be considered eligible for, would not be included in the count and wouldn't be eligible for equitable services if designated so.
Right. So that's in section 11. I'm sorry, I was understanding the question to mean for FAPE.
Yeah.
Was it not for FAPE?
It was about providing in-school services, and that does suggest FAPE.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So check on just what Dan said and look at the we have one single question in section L of the Q&A. Thanks.
The next question is regarding states considering homeschools as parentally placed private schools. Do you think this will change as a result of COVID? Meaning, will more states provide funds? We have seen former teachers creating homeschool pods.
I think it's tough for us to speculate on that. I think it's, I think coming out of the pandemic, I think we're going to see lots of different things. So might this happen? Yes. I don't, if I were to give a suggestion, I wouldn't use accessing permanently placed private school funds as the main motivation for expanding homeschooling, because it's probably not going to be enough funds to get that policy desire implemented. So, but then again, those are going to be state calls, right? And you know,
absolutely. It's up to each state, and if a state decides to do that, I think that's the kind of change that would need to be pretty widely disseminated and maybe even take public comment on. So it shouldn't be something that would sneak up on anybody.
There was a question about where services are provided, but that was asked ahead of you going into the details about where the services are provided and the transportation options. There is a question here too as to where would these proportionate amounts be publicized?
IDEA doesn't say specifically where. I think in our guidance, we say that it should be publicly available. They may be on the LEA website. They should be available upon request. That if, Dan, I don't know if you have any further information about that, that if someone wanted to inquire, they could ask the state or the LEA.
Yeah, and it's, you know, this is going to look very different in a large LEA that has, you know, hundreds of schools. So they should probably have a pretty robust website, and it sort of explains the process, and everyone can, you know, understand what consultation looks like and how service are provided, sort of logistics versus, you know, a smaller LEA that may have one private school where that's, you know, they're just going to do a lot of collaboration back and forth with the, you know, with the private school and the parent representatives. So it's tough to give a one size fits all, but and sometimes, like I said, states, if you can go to LEA allocations on state websites, they might actually have the proportionate share amounts where they'll do those calculations.
Okay. Another question is, can you cite the specific IDEA regulation which states that services should be provided on site at a child's private school?
I don't know if that's more of a policy interpretation than an actual regulation.
I think if you put multiple regs together and sort of,
Mhm.
I think there's a sound rationale behind
Look.
why we put that. I was looking through while Lisa was talking for this question, and we don't specifically say that, but think about this. If you're going to, you have a child who goes to private school, they're going to transport them away from their typically developing peers or their classmates, put them, place them with a related service provider in the school, then transport them back. Is child's missing a lot of interaction and potentially services that we would, if this child was receiving services in an LEA, would we want that to happen? That amount of time away from the LRE. So we obviously don't have LRE for equitable services that we do for IEPs, but there's sort of those sound considerations that I think is the reason why we said that.
Okay. Another question is, can a parent request an IE on the assessments the LEA conducts?
Yes, the requirements related to IEEs also apply to initial and reevaluations conducted for permanently placed private school children with disabilities. And Dan, I think we have something in the section on child fines specifically about that, in which who's responsible for it.
I just want to be clear that if assuming we're taking this in the context of for the provision of equitable services and right, then it's going to be the district where the private school is located versus the provision of FAPE, where it would be the LEO where the family resides.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the exact question so I can tell you to look. Keep talking among yourselves.
Okay.
Here it is. It's question A13 about the parent has the right to an IEE consistent with the requirements of 300.502. The LEA where the private school is located conducts the evaluation. If they disagree with it, they have the right to request an IEE from that LEA at public expense. Okay, so question
Thanks.
A13.
A13, great. Then there's a question here regarding COVID impacts. Is there something we should know when it comes to this population of students? Are recovery services a thing if LEAs were not providing equitable services when shutdowns occurred?
So I think I spoke to that a little bit about compensatory services for maybe failure to fully implement a services plan. It's all going to come down to whether the LEA has expended all of their proportionate share. It could be that those children are able to get compensatory services if the funds are still available. Theoretically, if they didn't get the services, the funds should still be available. I guess there could be arguments why they aren't. Go ahead, Dan.
No, it's this is something that a good, meaningful consultation process should be going through, and available balances.
Good.
This is what's going on. The other thing too is remember, back from Lisa and I were both fiscal people, is that anytime there's always 2 IDA grant years that are available, and then from July 1st to September 30th, there's a third grant. So they should be collaborating and making sure that the funds are being drawn down appropriately, and that you're trying to minimize carryovers, so that you're tapping into the funds that are going to expire first, and making sure that those equitable services being provided. And if they need to provide additional funds, or not additional funds, provide additional services to catch up or to get the funds spent down, do that through consultation. So that you don't have to deal with a complaint.
Yeah.
Then there was just a comment about staffing issues impacting equitable services, but then there is a question of what then is meant by discretionary funds as opposed to proportionate share.
I would say proportionate share is a required amount that must be spent. It can't be spent on other things. It's those funds, I don't know if reserved is the right word, but those funds have to be spent on that population of children. Discretionary fund sounds, I don't know what pot of discretionary funding the question is referring to, but an LEA does not have discretion to not use its proportionate share. Is that right, Dan?
Yeah, and I think the discretion, if and like I said, is not to say it's a grant, but it's to say that if an LEA chooses to spend additional funds beyond the proportionate share amount, they have the discretion to do so, but they don't have to. So that's where I don't know if that helps, but they're
Okay. And there's another question here. In our state, students that are homeschooled are considered to be in private schools. Did I understand that the LEA should provide the equitable services in the home?
it depends on what the consultation, right, determines, right? I mean, that's so it has to include both, right, the private schools and parent representatives. So maybe if there's a LEA with a large group of homeschool children, maybe they do. I know, and someone mentioned pods, so maybe they say, well, we're going to provide some equitable services for a pod and do it that way. But those are those discussions that are happening at the consultation process.
Then there's another question. If there's a dispute between the LEA and the private school over how funds are spent, where does that written explanation go? Can anybody adjudicate the difference?
So if there's a disagreement, if the LEA does not agree with the private school officials about how to spend the money or where to provide the services, they need to provide a written explanation. I think that was in one of Dan's slides. I'm not sure if they have to provide that to every single private school official or if it's just to the official that disagrees with them. I don't know that I've ever had that question before, but they do need to give a written explanation of the basis for why they're rejecting. Almost like that we don't say prior written notice, but you parent folks, you know what prior written notice is. It's sort of like that, like you wanted us to do this, but we're deciding to go a different way, and this is why we're doing that. Dan, do you have more to add to that?
Say it's a public, it should be a document's available on request or potentially posted, right? Said as part of our equitable services and provided for the year. I mean, and here's the reasons why we chose it.
Right.
So the explanation only needs to be made by the LEA. What about the private school?
Well, it's because the LEA is the folks who make the ultimate decision, right? They're the decision makers. So they're the ones who are going to take all the input and from parent groups and from the private schools and make that determination. So they should definitely share it, right? And I think it's probably, once again, is if nothing else, follow up at a part of the consultation meeting as well to say, here's the decision we made, here's what we decided on, and said this is as a former LEA director, this is tough because there's typically is not enough funds to go around to meet all the needs of all the permanently placed private school children. So the LEA has to make some tough choices, right? And so you want to maintain those good relationships so that you can say, when your input was really important, we took it all, and this is just based on the resources that we have through equitable services and the proportionate share. This is how we think it makes the best sense.
Yeah, the requirement is in 300-134E, the written explanation by the LEA regarding the services, how if they disagree with that's part of what they're going to talk about in consultation, how we're going to let you know if we disagree with you, all of that. We also didn't get into the other requirements. There are a lot of requirements around the LEA and the consultation process. As I said, we kind of focused just on what we thought parents needed to know most. But if you're interested more in how private school officials can file complaints, what's available to private school officials around this process, that's in the Q&A as well. So dive in and enjoy that reading. And if you have questions, feel free to follow up with us. You have our contact information there. Email works just fine.
So there's still several questions. Thank you all for hanging in here. If students in transition are in private school and want to transfer into a public school setting to defer, I'm assuming the ultimate transition to adult services, what are the requirements for them to attend the public school's extended transition services? And that may not be part of what you're doing here in this webinar.
Yeah, I don't have any direct knowledge of that. I would assume that LEAs and schools have requirements about re-enrolling or enrollment in the public school under IDEA. If you are eligible as a child with a disability, you're eligible for FAPE up through the age of whatever the FAPE cohort is for your state. It's often through age 21. So I'd encourage you to maybe check with your SEA or LEA about re-enrollment or enrollment processes.
Well, yeah,
ahead, Dan.
I was going to say it depends. What was the last time the child received an evaluation? How many years the child has been in the private school? And once again, it might be different LEAs. Once again, so you might be going back to the LEA where you live and request an evaluation for eligibility. If things
and assuming they haven't achieved a regular high school diploma, because that would end your eligibility for FAPE. So if they received a regular high school diploma from the private school, that would end the eligibility for FAPE.
Yeah.
Okay. And then where does the compelling reason language come from for services to be provided away from the private schools?
I think it's sort of similar to what we said before. I think that I can look and see. It's been a pretty long-standing position of OSEP. Again, I think it's a policy interest and not having to spend so much money on the proportionate share on transporting children, as well as, more importantly, not disrupting their educational experience to lose a lot of time from their private school to come over and receive a half-hour service of a related service across town or whatever the case may be.
Okay. I mean, if it's specialized transportation, is extremely expensive, right? So it'll eat into the proportionate share amounts very, very quickly. And even just getting a regular bus or some other way to transport the child, it's just that is a big line item. So to think that you can do this and without depleting the proportionate share funds would the money would disappear very, very quickly. So I think there's, like I said, there are those examples where it's just not feasible to provide the services in the private school. But I think in many of the situations, they probably can't occur in the private school.
And again, the LEA has some flexibility, whether they provide the service with their own staff or if they contract with a third party to provide the equitable services.
There's another question here that probably also may go beyond this discussion, which is, in our state, many LEAs only provide speech therapy through their service plans, and some only use it for speech therapy for students eligible under speech and language impairment. Is the equitable piece just about the proportionate share amount? How is it that they can exclude all the other eligibility categories?
You want to take it, Dan, or go for the consultation process?
I'm sorry to sound like a broken record. I think that's, if they're saying we provide speech only, once again, is maybe that's the desires of the private schools and parent representatives, that this is, I would think my experience is that we had more speech therapists than any other. So I think there are more children who have speech needs, speech language needs. So maybe that was the determination, but if the LEA is saying this is the only service you can get that we're going to provide, that's not very genuine and not probably consistent with a meaningful consultation process. Where if the private schools and parents are saying, yeah, these are the type of service we need to have some specialized instruction to help with our decoding skills of our kids with disabilities, and that's, they should really take that into consideration before saying, yeah, everyone's going to get speech therapy. We wouldn't say that would be okay for kids with an IEP that's saying everyone gets 1 hour speech therapy or everyone gets the same, that's all we provide. Right? We would say that winds up in state complaint land, right? If it's, everyone gets the same services, that's not, takes the eye out of individualized. So,
yeah, that is an area. Remember I said, what's the answer? C, state complaints, right? That could be something that's subject to a state complaint, as they did not, give meaningful consideration. I think in one of the Q&As we talk about the LEA cannot unilaterally decide, right? It has to be through the consultation process. And, you know, if there are folks there who are saying, no, what our kids really need is something else, and they disagree with that, remember there's the whole series of Q&As about how the LEA needs to respond to that, including providing an explanation for its decisions for the services it's going to provide.
Okay, and I think we're at the last question, which is a softball. Should our state advisory panels be reviewing data regarding this population of students and making recommendations to the state education agency?
I can't think of a reason why they would not. It's an IDA requirement. It may not be as large of a population perhaps as some of the other populations served throughout the state, but it certainly is the state's responsibility to ensure that LEAs are meeting these requirements, just like the other IDA requirements.
Okay. Well, I think that was the last question. There's some other comments in the question and answer that people can look at. But with that, and we're a little bit over at 5:11, thank you so much to Lisa and Dan for providing this really valuable information. And like you said, it's a lot of meat. And I think what's important is for the staff to go and look at these Q&A with more careful, and they know how to find you, Lisa and Dan, if they have any other more specific questions related to what they're experiencing. So with that, I just want to thank you. And I don't know, Carolyn or Miriam, if you had final words to say, or we're just going to end it here.
I
Carolyn?
think we can just close out, Carmen, but I did want to just reiterate your thank you to both Lisa and Dan for a great webinar today. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Very
Bye
good.
now.
Wonderful. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Enjoy the rest
Bye,
of the day.
everyone.
Bye.